The dust settled on her tongue like grit, a constant reminder of the town she was leaving, the life she was being sold from. Alara stood small and still beside the man who had bought her, his presence a solid, silent wall against the fading noise of the saloon where the transaction had taken place. Her husband, drunk and reeking of cheap whiskey and desperation, had haggled over her like livestock, listing her faults, her blindness chief among them. He called it uselessness. The buyer, a man named Elias she gathered from the slurred words, had listened without expression, his voice low and rumbling when he finally spoke, offering a sum that was both insult and salvation. She felt the pull on the rope tied loosely around her wrist, a leash that chafed more than the coarse fabric of her worn dress. She flinched, not from pain, but from the indignity. Elias didn't speak, but the tension in the rope lessened slightly. He moved with a quiet competence that was unnerving after years with a man whose every action was loud and clumsy. He led her away from the sounds of the town, the distant piano music, the raucous laughter, the mournful creak of the saloon sign. Soon, only the wind answered the shuffle of their boots on the dry earth. Fear was a cold stone in her gut, familiar but sharp tonight. What kind of man bought a blind woman? Not out of charity, surely. Her husband had hinted darkly about the kind of work she might be put to. Shame burned hot on her cheeks, a fire to contrast the internal ice. But beneath the fear, a tiny ember of defiance glowed. They could take her sight, they could take her freedom, they could trade her like coin, but they could not take the core of her. Not yet. She focused her remaining senses. The scent of dry earth and sage, stronger now. The feel of the wind, cooler as they moved away from the clustered buildings. Elias's footsteps, steady and unhurried, unlike her husband's lurching gait. His scent was clean, of leather and pipe smoke and something wild, like pine needles after rain. He wasn't gentle, but he wasn't brutal either. Just functional, like a tool wielded with economy of movement. He stopped, and she felt his hand release the rope, then grasp her arm, guiding her carefully. Step up. His voice was rough, low, a sound that vibrated in her bones. She navigated a step onto something hard and wooden, a wagon. He helped her up fully, settling her onto a rough seat. He released her arm and she heard him move around the wagon, the jingle of harness, the soft nickering of a horse. She drew her knees up to her chest, clutching her arms around herself. The small bundle of her meager possessions lay beside her, untouched by her husband's greedy hands only because he'd forgotten it. Inside were a few clothes, a smooth river stone she carried for luck, and the carefully wrapped object she hoped no one would ever find. It wasn't just her eyes she needed to keep hidden. This was something else entirely, something that could be both her salvation and her ruin. As the wagon began to roll, the rhythmic creak and the soft thud of the horse's hooves were the only sounds in the vast emptiness. She listened, straining to understand where she was being taken, who this silent man was, and what fate awaited her in the endless, sightless dark. The stone in her pocket felt cold, a small anchor in a world that had just been entirely upended. The journey stretched into a timeless expanse of sounds and sensations. The sun beat down, hot on her skin. Then the air grew cooler, the wind sharper, carrying the scent of distant mountains. The rhythmic creak of the wagon became a lullaby, punctuated by the occasional snort of the horse or Elias's quiet click to urge it on. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was instruction, hold on, or bump coming. Terse, necessary words, devoid of warmth or cruelty. Alara listened to him, to the subtle shifts in his breathing, the way he handled the reins, the weight of his presence beside her. He wasn't like the men she had known, loud, boastful, quick to anger or drunken sentimentality. Elias was quiet, observant. She felt his gaze on her sometimes, a tangible weight even without seeing it. Was it curiosity, assessment, or something else? She kept her face smooth, revealing nothing of the turmoil within. She had learned long ago to hide her feelings, a skill honed in the harsh light of her husband's disapproval and the pitying or scornful looks of others. Now, She had another secret to guard, a physical one that made her even more vulnerable. The landscape changed slowly, signaled by the sounds under the wheels and the scents on the wind. The dry plains gave way to rockier ground. The air grew cleaner, sharper. She heard the rushing sound of water in the distance at one point, a fleeting promise of life in this austere land. Elias stopped by a stream, and she heard him dismount, the splash of water, the grateful blowing of the horse. He came back to the wagon, offering her a cupped hand filled with cold water. She drank gratefully, the chill a shock against the dryness of her mouth. His hand was calloused, rough against her skin, yet the water was pure. A small kindness, perhaps accidental, that resonated louder than any words. They reached his dwelling as dusk painted the sky in colors she could only imagine. She smelled pine smoke, heard the soft lowing of a cow, the clucking of chickens. It wasn't a town or even a cluster of buildings. It was solitary, isolated. His world. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands firm on her waist. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff from the long ride. He didn't let go until she was steady. He led her inside. The air was warm, smelling of wood smoke and cooking meat. A different kind of warmth than the sun's, one that spoke of shelter and hearth. He guided her hand to a chair, rough-hewn wood. Sit, she sat, listening as he moved about, stirring the fire, preparing food. He placed a plate in her hand's stew. She smelled it, rich and savory. She ate slowly, using her fingers, unsure of where utensils might be, not wanting to ask. The food was simple but filling, the first real meal she'd had in days that wasn't scraps or bar nuts. After eating, she felt him observing her again. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. She knew what he was likely thinking. What use was she? She was blind. She was a woman alone in his remote cabin, bought for a pittance. What could she offer? How long before he regretted his purchase? But he said none of this. Instead, he pointed her towards a rough bed in the corner. You can sleep there. His tone was neutral. He didn't touch her, didn't demand anything. He simply turned away to bank the fire. She lay on the straw-filled mattress, pulling a coarse blanket over herself. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the crackling fire and Elias's steady breathing from across the room. She listened, her senses on high alert, trying to discern his nature, his intentions. And she kept her secret tucked away, a heavy, dangerous weight against her ribs. This isolation, she realized, might offer a hiding place, but it also meant there was no one else to turn to if her secret was discovered, or if the past caught up to her. Days blurred into a rhythm dictated by the sun's position and the demands of the land. Alara began to learn the layout of the cabin by touch, the rough-hewn walls, the sturdy table, the perpetually warm hearth, the water pail by the door. Elias set her simple tasks, folding blankets, shelling dried beans. She could not see the dirt, but she could feel the textures, smell the dampness, learn where things were kept by sound and feel. She was slow at first, clumsy, but she was determined. She would not be useless. She could not be useless. Elias watched her. Sometimes she felt his gaze linger, assessing. He rarely offered praise, but neither did he offer condemnation. He corrected her errors with a quiet word or a gentle, guiding hand, showing her how to find the beans she'd dropped, how to fold a blanket edge straight. It was a different kind of instruction than she'd ever received, practical and patient. He taught her to navigate the immediate surroundings of the cabin, how many steps to the well, the path to the outhouse marked by a rope strung between two trees, the location of the woodpile by the scent of pine and the sound of his axe. The chopping of wood became a soundtrack to her days. The sharp thwack as the axe bit deep, the split crack as the wood gave way, the solid thud as the pieces fell. She would sit nearby, listening, learning the cadence of his labor. One afternoon he placed an axe in her hand, heavy and cool. "Feel the balance," he said, his voice quiet. He guided her hands, placing them correctly on the handle. He stood behind her, his chest a warm, steady presence against her back, helping her feel the movement of the swing, the moment of impact. She could never chop wood like him, but she learned to split smaller pieces, using her other senses, the feel of the grain, the sound the axe made against the wood. It was tiring, awkward, but it was work, and it was shared. Their conversations remained minimal, functional, but understanding grew in the silences, in the shared effort of survival. She learned to anticipate his needs, sensing when the fire needed more wood, when he was coming back from a long day outside and would need water. He, in turn, seemed to anticipate hers, placing a cup of water within reach, leaving a shawl where she could easily find it. One evening, a coughing fit seized her, deep and ragged. She tried to stifle it, but it shook her whole body. Elias was instantly beside her, his hand on her back, firm and steady. He pressed a tin cup into her hand, warm and smelling of herbs. "Drink this. It'll help." She drank the bitter concoction gratefully. As she coughed again, something shifted near her ribs, causing a sharp intake of breath. She tensed instinctively, pulling away slightly. He paused, his hand still on her back. "You're hurt," he stated, not a question. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the secret she guarded. She tried to brush it off. "Old injury. Doesn't bother me." His hand didn't move immediately. She felt his stillness, his careful observation. She knew he didn't believe her. The something more she was hiding wasn't just a memory or a possession. It was part of her physical self, a vulnerability far greater than her blindness. The air grew thick with unspoken knowledge, a new layer added to the tentative trust they had built. She waited, breathless, for his reaction, dreading the questions, the suspicion, the potential unraveling of the fragile safety she had found. The sound of an approaching horse, urgent and familiar, shattered the quiet of the afternoon. Alara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. That gait, that particular rhythm, it was him, her husband. Fear, cold and paralyzing, seized her. She hadn't expected him to find her here, in this remote place. She scrambled backwards from the chopping block, tripping over her own feet, the small axe clattering to the ground. Elias emerged from the cabin, his face grim. He hadn't needed her to tell him who it was. He read it in her sudden panic, the way her body language shifted from quiet determination to sheer terror. He didn't ask questions. He simply moved between her and the sound, a silent barrier. Her husband rode into the small clearing, looking even more disheveled and drunk than she remembered, his face contorted with rage. "There you are, you worthless piece of property," he snarled, his eyes fixing on Elias. "I sold her, all right, but I didn't say you could just keep her. She's mine to do with as I please." Elias stood his ground, silent, his posture radiating a calm, dangerous strength. He didn't reach for a weapon, not yet. He just waited. Alara huddled behind him, trembling. The pain in her side flared, sharp and agonizing, a physical manifestation of her fear. She knew why he had come back. Not for her, but for something he believed she had stolen, something tied to the secret she carried. She couldn't let him take her, not now, not with the life growing inside her. The secret, the reason for the hidden injury, the reason she'd been so careful, so guarded, was no longer just hers. It belonged to the child she carried. Her husband dismounted, stumbling slightly, pulling a pistol from his belt. "Get out of the way, backwoods trash. That's my wife. And she owes me." Elias finally spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through the man's drunken bluster. "She's under my roof now. She's not going anywhere with you." Enraged, her husband lunged forward, raising the pistol. It was a moment of chaotic sound and movement. Alara, guided by instinct and the sounds around her, reacted. She remembered the heavy axe head she'd been using earlier. Scrambling on the ground, her hands found the tool, cold and solid. She couldn't see, but she heard her husband's heavy boots charging, Elias's sharp intake of breath as they grappled. With a surge of desperate strength, she swung the axe blindly, aiming for the sound of the charge, the familiar, hated presence. She felt the impact, not metal against wood, but a sickening thud and a strangled cry. Her husband crumpled. Silence descended, broken only by heavy breathing Elias's and her own ragged gasps. Elias was beside her instantly, his hands checking her, pulling her upright. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She shook her head, clinging to him, the axe falling from her numb fingers. It was over. The immediate threat was gone. But the truth she had hidden for so long was now laid bare. Later, after Elias had dealt with the body with grim efficiency, he knelt beside her by the firelight. The flickering flames illuminated his face, etched with exhaustion and something she couldn't read. She expected questions, judgment. Instead, he reached out, his large hand covering hers. "The coughing," he said quietly. "The pain." She swallowed, the words catching in her throat. I'm with child." His hand tightened slightly around hers. He looked at her then, a long, steady look that seemed to see not just her blindness, not just the fear she still carried, but something deeper. There was no shock, no disgust, no anger, only a quiet understanding. In that moment, the wall between them crumbled entirely. Survival had forged a bond, necessity had built trust, but this shared vulnerability, this quiet acceptance of the life she carried, solidified something new. He hadn't bought a blind woman. He had found a partner in the desolate quiet, a fellow survivor. The harsh environment had tested them. The cruelty of her past had threatened to destroy them. But resilience, hers and perhaps his own hidden one, had seen them through. Alara, once adrift and fearing her own hidden truth, found strength not despite her vulnerability, but because of it, and in the silent, steady presence of the man who had taken her in. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like their own to face, together. Dignity wasn't given. It was claimed, often in the most unexpected places, born from hardship and the fierce, quiet will to protect what little you had left. And now she had more than she'd ever expected.